So if you're just joining us, and I think we have a couple of guests, we've been for the better part of a year in a series on the biblical theology of government and politics. And we are now in a section on the history of the church's relationship to the state, to earthly governments. And just a quick review, most of you probably have this memorized by now, but we looked at the first 300 years of Christianity were pretty severe persecution of the church under Rome, but Rome falls in 476. And the church, as Rome and society collapses, the church is the only real institution that holds together. And so society begins to increasingly look to the church for organization and leadership. As the church's influence and resources grow, the temptations that come along with that also grow. We looked at the political power of the Pope peaked around 1200 AD, and that's also sort of about the time when church corruption peaked. So the Reformation, which took place, which began in 1517, was a response to a lot of the corruption in the church, trying to reform the church from within. It ended up being a whole new branch of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation. So we see the rise of independent nation states that we talked about this last week, led to a lot of devastating wars in the 1600s. And secular evangelists, if I can use that word, who came along in the latter part of the 1600s and the early 1700s, they blamed all of that religious conflict on the Reformation and the splintering of the church that came out of the Reformation. But in a lot of ways, and it was labeled as the wars of religion in the 1600s. But we talked last week about how that's really not a very honest, it's not a very true account of what actually happened. But nevertheless, that false narrative of religion as particularly violent and particularly dangerous, that narrative got a lot of traction and became justification for trying to remove government from, or to remove faith from government and from public life. And we looked last week at the fact that it's really impossible to be neutral. Our modern governments attempt to be neutral in regard to religion or in regard to morality or regard to right and wrong, when actually neutrality is sort of a mirage. It's not really possible to be neutral about anything, right? We talked last time about how many national leaders, they embrace Protestantism, not necessarily always for theological reasons, but often more for territorial reasons. And probably exhibit 1A of that is where we're going to start this week. When you talked about the Reformation a couple weeks ago with Tom, you talked about kind of the four streams of the Reformation. And one of those four streams was the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. And you remember this guy, this is King Henry VIII of England. He's an example of government leaders who broke away from the authority of the Catholic Church, not so much for theological reasons. He wanted a divorce from his Catholic wife. Well, he would have been Catholic too. The whole nation would have been Catholic. His wife was not producing a male heir, so he wanted to divorce her. The Pope would not permit him to divorce her, and so he declared himself the head of the church in England and declared the English church to be independent from the universal church. He really was not interested in making any theological changes or even any stylistic changes to forms of worship. He just wanted to be free of, he just wanted to do what he wanted to do. But in the country of England, you had many people who did sincerely embrace the Protestant teachings of the reform of the church, who sincerely embraced a return to the gospel, a return to the Bible, a return to the core teachings of the faith. And those people came to be called Puritans. They came to not like Henry VIII very much because they felt like he wasn't willing to go far enough in reforming the English church along Protestant principles. Does that make sense? So, the Puritans, again, this is a group of believers, Christian believers, who want far more reform of the church in England than what King Henry will allow. They believe that the church in England is still too Catholic in its theology, too Catholic in its forms of worship. And so the king comes to very much dislike this pesky little group of people called the Puritans, and he actually comes to try to suppress them, to try to keep them from spreading and growing in England. And so the establishment in England is the king. That didn't really change, but the established church is now the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And the Anglican Church begins to oppress Puritans who are pushing for more reform and change within the church. Does that make sense? You're tracking kind of the chronology of how this is unfolding. And we'll see how this will roll over into the founding of America and have lots of implications. We're moving toward, just to try to game this out. Next week we will not meet because of Thanksgiving. The week after that, we're going to try to look at the Enlightenment. The week after that, we're going to look at the American Revolution. And then I think we'll probably spend 2 weeks on the American Revolution, and then it'll be Christmas, and then I think we'll be done. That's our goal. So we'll see. Henry VIII dies at a fairly natural age. How do you think his ex-wife, his former wife, who he divorced, she remained Catholic? Not surprisingly, she was with the Pope, right? They had a daughter together named Mary. When King Henry VIII dies, he actually has a sickly son who lives for a couple of years, but he dies. So all he has is daughters, and his oldest daughter, Mary, inherits the throne of England. And she is loyal to her mother. She grew up with her Catholic mother. And so she believes it is her duty to undo all the reforms that her father did and to go back to Catholicism, leading the nation. Henry actually ended up having 6 different wives who he either divorced or beheaded, and one sickly son who I think he died around the age of, he was king for a year or two, and then he died around the age of 15. And so Mary, the devout Catholic, she's sort of brought out of mothballs. She's a young woman also, but she inherits the throne because that's how it works in England. And she makes it her goal to root out the Protestants and to bring back Catholicism as the head of England. She also dies as a fairly young woman. She only reigns for 4 years, but she comes to be known as, anybody know her nickname? Bloody Mary, because she executed over 300 Protestants who refused to recant, mostly Protestant leaders. And many of the Puritans and just Protestants in general flee, and where they flee to, many of them, is to the city of Geneva. I don't know if that rings a bell. Geneva is in Switzerland. It was the home of Calvin, John Calvin, who was an important leader in the Reformation on the continent of Europe. And he turned Geneva into a Christian city-state. And Geneva was this grand experiment in what it would be like to have a state, a nation, run strictly on Christian principles. And so many Puritans flee to Geneva for refuge, but they also learn from Calvin, study with Calvin. They translate the Bible into English. It's called the Geneva Bible, before the King James Bible. And Calvin was very interested in thinking through, how does Christianity relate to the state? How does this new Protestant doctrine of the old faith, how does it relate to the Christian faith? The Catholics were very interested in church-state harmony, and we talked, what's the word for that? You guys remember, for weaving church and state together closely? Christendom, right? And so Calvin was for Christendom. He just wanted a Protestant Christendom instead of a Catholic Christendom. That's an important thing to remember. So these Protestants English Protestants, Puritans, are biding their time, studying with Calvin, observing how he runs Geneva, and they're waiting till God removes Mary so that they can go back and import these ideas into the running of England. Does that make sense? Okay. So Mary dies fairly young. She was fairly sickly too. She dies, and she is replaced on the throne by her half-sister, not brother from another mother, but sister from another mother. And she ends up reigning. She was the longest reigning monarch until the Queen Elizabeth, who just died a couple of years ago. And she was raised Protestant, so she steers the country back from the direction Mary was trying to take it. She takes it back in a Protestant direction. And she never marries, never produces an heir, which becomes kind of a constant source of tension in the kingdom. She's very practical, very pragmatic. She's interested in stability. And so she makes the country officially Protestant. The Church of England is officially Protestant, but she keeps a lot of Catholic style of worship. So when you think of the liturgy and the cathedrals and the bells and smells and all of that Catholic style of worship and Catholic style of church leadership. So you have this hierarchy of archbishop and bishop. And so she was probably more interested in theology than her father, Henry VIII, was. But the thing she was most interested in was social stability. So she keeps Protestant theology, but she keeps kind of a Catholic worship style and Catholic form of church government. And so you would think she made everybody mad, but she's actually thought of as one of the best leaders that England's had, because she kept her nearly 50-year reign was a time of real stability coming out of a time of a lot of turbulence. She does hold to a hierarchical form of church government, not a congregational style. It's very much top-down from this. You can imagine how the Puritans feel about this. They're initially hopeful that she will take them back in a strong reforming direction, and she only goes about halfway, so they get frustrated at her. Everybody tracking so far? Is this making sense? Okay. So when Queen Elizabeth dies at the beginning of the 1600s, she never married, never produced an heir. So who comes to the throne? James the First, who is a cousin. I don't know if it was a first cousin or distant cousin, but he was the next living male heir in line to the throne by whatever complicated system they used. So King James the First, he actually was was Scottish. He was living in Scotland, which was very Protestant, Scotch Presbyterian at this point. So when he moved to England from Scotland, the Puritans were really excited that this guy was going to be for them, for their cause, for the continuing to reform the church. But as it turns out, when he took the throne, he's like, these people are pesky and they're bothering me. I don't like them. That is the Puritans. And he threatens to drive them from this land. He asserted even more than a lot of kings before him what he called the divine right of kings. In other words, God made me the king so I can kind of do whatever I want. Parliament had been getting stronger as a balance to the monarchy, and he dissolved Parliament. He said, you guys can all go home now, we're done with Parliament, I'm just going to run things. He gave one concession to the people. Anybody know what that was? The King James Bible. His goal was that the King James Bible would be sort of this uniting translation that would get everybody pulling in the same direction. So that's King James. Thoughts on this guy or questions?
For the record, Puritans stayed with the Geneva Bible.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What did he say?
The Puritans stayed with the Geneva Bible because they came to distrust King James and his Bible.
It's hilarious that somebody would think that a diverse group of people can read the same Bible and all arrive at the same conclusions. I mean, come on.
So this is just an aside. I wasn't planning to go here, but Luther did a translation of the Bible into German, and it's sort of like our modern day study Bibles. He did a lot of notes in the margins, and he did the notes that he did about the Hebrew midwives who, when they were supposed to kill the Hebrew babies under the time of Moses and the Egyptians. And that Luther's note was Christians should often disobey their rulers when they're told to do something wrong. And then James wanted to take that out of the notes because he didn't want people questioning the king. So he had it was still a translation of the Bible. And actually the King James Version is a very good translation. It was, for a long time, it was the best English translation in existence, and it's still a beautiful, very good translation. So I don't have anything against the King James Version, but in the study notes, it was very much pro-monarchy. All of the passages that could be interpreted as for or against kings were all interpreted for kings. The notes, not the actual Bible translation itself. So the Puritans came to be associated more with Parliament against the king, and the king became more associated with, the king against the Parliament. And the Anglican Church was very much the established church of the king and of no change, right? Of not shaking anything up. Whereas the Puritans, the Presbyterians were aligned with the Puritans. So when you had this low-grade war, or not really a war, but a conflict between the king and the Parliament, the Puritans were on the side of Parliament. The king was on the side of the king. But it actually did erupt into an actual civil war in England between the supporters of Parliament and supporters of the king. And surprisingly, probably, I think this is surprising, the Puritans actually won. And they gained control over the nation. Their leader, who they couldn't call him a king because they were against kings, right? But he became the leader of the nation. I think he was called Lord Protector. Does that sound right? Oliver Cromwell. They actually executed the guy who was next, who was the king, Charles I. They actually, this is a pretty dramatic revolution that they executed the king. And Puritans ruled the country for 12 years from 1646 to 1658. Cromwell has kind of a bad reputation, but he actually was, as someone who had lived as a religious minority under the established Anglican Church, he did have a lot of sympathy for religious minorities. And so he actually allowed quite a bit of religious tolerance, a lot more than what is popularly thought, if people popularly think of Cromwell. His tolerance did not extend to Catholics, but within the big soup that was English Protestants, he was more tolerant of different groups and different kinds of opinions religiously. So the Puritans ruled England for the middle part of the 1600s, but they had a dilemma, right? And this is we're still trying to work out this dilemma today. This dilemma is actually never going away until Christ comes back, which is, on one side, it's true to say there's one God, there's one true faith, there's one true religion, and the nation and its laws should recognize that one true God and its one true faith, right? That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is freedom of conscience for people to worship as they wish. Can you see the tension inherent in this, right? How much should we hold to narrow interpretations of doctrine and the truth versus giving people the freedom to believe wrong things, right? That's a tension that probably is never going away until Jesus comes back. And this tension this is going to be part of the rest of the story as we talk about the Puritans into America and then even right up to present day. Does this make sense? This is a really important idea that's going to be one of our central ideas this morning.
So I
Yeah.
was over in Parliament this week, and I was surprised that there's still like 86 bishops actually in Parliament.
Yeah.
And then they were actually, when we were in there, bishops were standing up on something.
Mm-hmm.
And primarily they were to keep the church intact.
Yeah.
Keep the church in good standing.
Yeah. Lynn was saying to me, where's Lynn, this morning, what were you saying about, King Charles, the current King of England, the ceremonies to inaugurate him, I don't know if you remember those a couple of years ago, they're very, very religious. They're run by the Archbishop. He is still considered the protector of the Church of England. That goes all the way back to Henry VIII. That's a 500-year-old. Now, does everybody believe it like they did 500 years ago? No, some of it's formal, but when you saw the death, sometimes people are like, this is totally formal, it's totally a sham, it's totally just pomp and circumstance. But when, for example, Queen Elizabeth, who just died a couple of years ago, when you saw the outpouring of emotion of the nation and a genuine religious sentiment, there's still a pretty deeply embedded religious sense in England, even though it's a pretty secular nation. And part of that is because they've never officially divorced church and state. There's still an official canopy over the nation of this close relationship between church and state.
Still pretty strong. It's been less than 100 years ago that another king gave up the throne of England because the Church of England would not grant a divorce.
That's exactly right. And everybody was thinking of Henry VIII. Yeah, Queen Elizabeth, who just died, her father, what Tom is referring to, her father assumed the throne when his older brother? His older brother was in line to be king, became king, but wanted a divorce from his wife and to marry a divorcee from America. And the Archbishop said, this was leading into World War II. This is a real crisis for the nation. And the Archbishop was like, no, I can't grant you there's no there's no biblical basis for this divorce. So he said, well, I give up the throne to my brother. That was less than 100 years ago.
Serious crisis throughout World War II because the Nazis figured that wasn't out for them if they took over.
Yeah, they had him sort of stashed away and waiting to the Nazis to bring him back when they conquered Britain. Yeah.
This is a silly question, but directed at you as our teacher. In the fabric of all of it, the message of the gospel, the pure stuff, there's got to be believers in both camps.
And it's true, yeah. There were believers, there were genuine believers who had genuine differences of opinion about interpretation of Scripture. Yeah. Yeah, I would say the concern for the gospel, the fervent concern for the gospel to be elevated was definitely stronger among the Puritans. I mean, that they were really trying to get back to a biblical interpretation of the gospel. Sometimes the Church of England was more, hey, let's just keep the status quo, let's keep things stable. And so there was that push-pull between those two groups. But they all would have, nearly all of them would have believed in God, believed that Jesus was his son, that we should all live under God's law. Some of it was differences of interpretation, is like, how far do we go in implementing God's law into actual society and society's laws? Right. Okay, so the Puritans try to run the country for 12 years. They try to run it on Puritan principles. It doesn't go very well, and they have a hard time agreeing amongst themselves. Even among the Puritans, you have some that are more like really, really hardcore. Some are more, there's just always a spectrum, right? But they have a hard time agreeing amongst themselves. So the King Charles I got executed. His son fled to France. I think it was France. They brought him back from France, and they reinstalled a king, Charles II. And England has officially had a king ever since. It's called the Restoration. Right? So the Puritans still are not really satisfied with the religious situation in England, still often oppressed or sometimes outright persecuted by the religious establishment. And so a group of them decide to try to form a new society in the New World. And so when we think, this is a great week for this, right? This is Thanksgiving. This is the Mayflower. These are the pilgrims that we're celebrating this week, right? They didn't do this on purpose, but they came to America on the Mayflower. Of course, there was nobody here but Native Americans. They didn't know they're mostly city people. They didn't know what they were doing, so they nearly starved to death. But tens of thousands of Puritans followed in the next number of years, in the decades that followed. And they really do see themselves as the new Israel. They were pretty explicit about this. They were leaving tyranny of the king. They were crossing not the Red Sea, but the Atlantic Ocean, and they were coming to this wilderness, this land of milk and honey, that was going to be the new promised land. And that was, they explicitly thought in these terms. And many of them came to believe that perhaps this will bring in the kingdom, perhaps this will usher in God's kingdom on earth. So the Puritans settled New England, so the northeast corner of course it was, the colonies were just on the coast, so it was just the north part of the colonies. These were deeply devout Protestant, Calvinist Christians, and who are processing all the stuff that they learned from Calvin and Geneva, and they believe in a very Old Testament kind of covenant between God and society. if you look at their sermons, they actually spend a lot more time talking and thinking about the Old Testament and God's covenant relationship with Israel in the Old Testament. And they very much believed in a very close cooperation, interweaving of church and state. Because if God is God, then we should have all of God's laws in society. And so they required church attendance for everyone. They punished people who violated church attendance. But they really did see themselves and describe themselves as a city on a hill, a light to the nations. That God was going to, in the new world, with this renewal of the church, that this would be a light to all of Europe who was still kind of living in their unreformed darkness, right? And some New England colonies, Connecticut, for example, they turn it over to the religious leaders, the pastors, to take the book of Leviticus and let's translate Leviticus into civil law for our colony. And so, the book of Leviticus, including a lot of the capital punishment parts, were carefully incorporated into colony law, civil law. Does that make sense? Here's a key point. The American colonies prior to the Revolutionary War, so we're talking the 1600s and at least the first half of the 1700s, they were not trying to get rid of Christendom. They weren't trying to separate out church and state. They very much wanted a Christendom. They just wanted a Christendom on Puritan Protestant lines rather than the old Roman Catholic form of Christendom that was still existent in much of Europe. Does that make sense? They were not interested in a separation of church and state at all. Okay.
Can I ask a question about
Yeah.
Leviticus? So did they do like the eye for an eye type of law, or what do you?
Yeah, I haven't actually read their law codes, but I don't know if I don't know. They were certainly trying to literally incorporate Levitical law into civil law. Yeah. So here's the problem. The strict kind of Levitical law over civil government in New England, this only lasts for a couple of generations. Why? Well, you have a lot of new people coming who really who are coming for a variety of different reasons, right? Maybe for economic reasons, maybe they're entrepreneurial people. And you just have this thing that always happens, which is just because you are a strong believer does not guarantee that your children or grandchildren will have the same strong convictions, right? So, and another key factor that probably isn't talked about nearly enough, and that is simply the opportunity to spread out. So Europe had very densely populated with all of these little nation states. And if you had a religious conflict, there was really nowhere else to go. You pretty much had to hammer it out, hash it out there. And so you usually ended up with winners and losers, right? Whatever settlement was agreed to, somebody was going to prevail and somebody was not. In the New World, what happened? If you have a religious disagreement between two groups or two parties in the same group, you're just going to move west, right? Instead of staying here and fighting over this, how we're going to implement it in this place in these 5 square miles, the one group, probably the group who loses, is just going to pack up and move further west and establish their own version of doing this with enough distance that I'm not in conflict with you. So in the vast American continent, the vast American wilderness, dissenters, that is religious minorities, they just moved west. So you could call it geographic pluralism. Right? Pluralism means you have a wide variety of beliefs. In Europe, they kind of had to hash them out. In America, you could just move. Go ahead, Tom.
It doesn't start with the dissenters in America, that's who you were coming from America.
That's what America was.
That's what we were.
Was mostly religious people who were religious minorities in Europe, and they came over here to get away from persecution.
We're different all up and down the coast.
Exactly. So New England was Puritan, Virginia was Anglican, the southern states were Baptist or Methodist. So each colony had its own different. What's that?
In the middle, you have this Catholic.
Maryland was Catholic. Yeah. So you get the different colonies have these different flavors. Almost, with the exception of Maryland, they're all Protestant flavors, but they're all different flavors of Protestant Christians. Does that make sense? So this is exactly what Tom just said. In other regions of America, other religious groups arrive, most of them religious minorities who are fleeing some kind of religious oppression or persecution in Europe, and they settle in specific colonies. So each colony has its own official state religion. There was established religion in all of the colonies, just like there had been in Europe. But in Europe, it was all Roman Catholic up until the Reformation. So this fact that all of the colonies had their own established state church, that largely comes to an end by the time of the Revolutionary War, 1770, late 1700s. The exception to that is, anybody want to guess? Puritan New England, who holds on to their established state church until I think the 1830s, before they finally disestablished the state church in New England. Questions about this or thoughts about this? So this leads to some really interesting alliances and strange bedfellows. We're going to talk about one of those. Thomas Jefferson was Virginian, Anglican. How do you think Thomas Jefferson... We're going to talk next week about the Enlightenment, which was definitely a secular movement. Thomas Jefferson was deeply bought into the principles of the Enlightenment and secularism. How do you think he felt about the Puritans? Just a guess. He deeply disliked the Puritans. He did not like them at all. So we're jumping ahead a little bit. We're now 1800. America has been. We'll come back and talk about the American Revolution, but this is just to continue on this theme of religious liberty, religious freedom. 1800, the U.S. is now its own established nation. It's one of the first. Washington was the president for 8 years, and then John Adams became the second president of the U.S. He won the election of 1796. And so he's now been serving 4 years, and we have only the second election in U.S. history in 1800. John Adams is from New England. His roots are all Puritan roots. He's a conservative. He's more religiously orthodox by a good measure than is Jefferson. And so these two men become pretty fierce rivals, running to unseat John Adams is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is a deist. He doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ or the Trinity. He was an enthusiastic early supporter of the French Revolution, which we'll talk about next time. The Jefferson Bible, he literally took a scissors and cut out all the stuff that was miraculous. The Jefferson Bible is just the 4 Gospels. But the final paragraph of the Jefferson Bible is, and they rolled a stone over Jesus' tomb and went away. That's the end. So he was not a Orthodox Christian in any sense of the word. So these two men have very different ideas about reality. They have very different ideas about religion. This is in the election of 1800 was a bitter contest. Some people didn't know if the early United States system of government would survive the election of 1800. If you think 2024 was bad, go read what they called each other back then. So the most famous conservative newspaper, Adams is the conservative here, right? Jefferson would be considered more the liberal. The most famous conservative newspaper in America was the Philadelphia Gazette. It was a more New England I know Philadelphia isn't New England, but it was the Federalist Party, which was New England, which was the Puritan roots. They repeatedly ran an ad in their paper, and here's the ad. It says, this is a question that they wanted people to ask themselves. Shall I continue in allegiance to God and a religious president, that's John Adams, or impiously declare for Jefferson and no God? Trump did not invent the all caps and the exclamation points. So this was sort of the sentiment that was floating around in the air. Jefferson won. It was a tight election. He won, defeated the more Puritan, more conservative, more Orthodox Christian Adams of New England. This is where we get to some interesting alliances and interesting bedfellows. So there's a group of people, Baptists, in New England, Danbury, I think, Connecticut. Anyway, it's New England. They were Baptists, and all of the laws, because New England was run by Puritans, all of the laws favored Puritans and sort of disfavored everybody who wasn't Puritan. So the Baptists did not like the Puritans and felt like they were oppressed by them. So the Baptists actually, even though they were religiously conservative, they favored Jefferson because Jefferson was trying to weaken the grip of the Puritans on society. Does that make sense? So the Danbury Baptists wrote a letter after Jefferson's victory to congratulate him on his presidential victory, and he was happy to receive their support. He wrote them a letter back. This is an exact quote of Jefferson's letter back to the New England Baptist Society. He said, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between a man and his God." In other words, this is a private affair between you and your God. This is not a social. This is not for civil government. That he owes account to none other than God for his faith or his worship. That legitimate powers of government reach actions only, not opinions or not religious opinions. I contemplate that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the First Amendment he's quoting. Thus building a wall of separation between church and state. That wall of separation is not actually used in the Constitution, this is where that phrase comes from, is this letter. I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tends to restore to man all his natural rights. This is a 1802 letter to the Connecticut Baptists.
To be
In there.
totally fair with the text, though, he is referring to that first amendment. He's establishing that.
Yes, yeah. So, right. So, but you understand, like, it creates some strange alliances, right? So what you have in the colonies is a really mixed bag. You have Enlightenment rationalists like Thomas Jefferson pushing for separation of church and state, pushing for disestablishment of state churches, because they don't want the church exerting influence on civil society, right? On the other hand, you have religious minorities like the Baptists in New England who are pushing also for separation of church and state, but for a completely different reason, because they don't want the state influencing the church, right? They don't want the Puritans telling the Baptists what to do. So they want separation of church and state for a very different reason than what Jefferson wants it, right? But they're allied in their desire to have less close cooperation between church and state. Does that make sense?
Can I ask an opinion?
Yeah.
What do you think about that process?
I think, well, that's sort of what this whole class has been trying to work out, right, for the last year. I mean, in some ways, this is the core of the matter, is what should the relationship between God's law and human government, what should that relation look like? And I think we'll answer that more as we get into it. But actually, this third point has a lot to do with the answer to that question. Most people throughout the colonies, most people did not think like Jefferson, actually. Jefferson sort of probably disguised what he actually believed about religion so he could get elected. Most people still had a real sense that religion was necessary for the good of society, necessary for good order, necessary for virtue among the citizens. If you don't have virtuous citizens, it doesn't matter what your system of government is, it's not going to work. And so most people, still had this very strong sense that religion ought to be a vital part of society. In that sense, it's quite different from modern America. In modern America, these people who believe this are a minority. In colonial America, this was almost everybody, right? Now, what that influence should look like, even men like Jefferson and Ben Franklin, who were not Orthodox Christians at all, believed that you needed some source of virtue in society, and Christianity was likely to be the best source of that. So in early America, what you have is what I would call an unofficial Christendom. So still this very close connection, not a formal connection, but a very real influence of the church over civil society. I say it's a real Christendom because the influence of the church and the influence of Christianity on American society was deep and was pervasive and shot through everything, right? And very few people questioned the rightness of that. But it's not a formal or official Christendom as it is in Europe. As we talked about in England, to this day, they have an official relationship between the English church and the English government, right? So it's disestablished officially and formally, But in many ways, the unofficial Christendom of America lasted longer than the official Christendom of most European states. And we'll talk more about why that's the case. Does this make sense? As an informal Christendom, right? Informal, it has less influence over official institutions, such as government institutions or other educational institutions. You can, if you go to England today and listen to the BBC, we have NPR, they have BBC, right? It's their national broadcasting. There's still lots of Christian content on the BBC today that's state funded. And some of it is actually, so C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity was originally a series of talks that C.S. Lewis gave on the BBC. You can still hear some of that kind of stuff on the BBC today. You hear nothing like that in NPR, right? So the institutional influence was greater in Europe, but it had a great deal of informal influence. And this is where you have which is better, which is worse, these pros or cons. They both have pros and they both have cons, right? We'll get to some more of those in a second. But again, this tension between freedom of conscience for people to worship as they wish versus should the state be involved in the protection of correct Orthodox doctrine. A good case study is the Mormons, right? Mormonism never would have survived in Europe. It would have been squashed, right? It would have been outlawed. It would have not been permitted. My ancestors, about 6 or 7 generations back on my mom's side, they were Mormons from New England. They fled New England because their neighbors were like, you guys aren't real Christians. We're not going to allow you to meet. So they left, right? Mormonism was not permitted in Puritan New England. They were driven out. But what did they do? They just kept going west. And they kept getting, I don't know if persecuted is the right word, but people did not like them. People recognized this is a false doctrine of Christianity. This is not a true doctrine. And so we're not going to allow you guys to meet, to have your church meetings. So what do? They just kept going west until they got far enough out of their reach that they got into the wilderness where nobody else was, right? That kind of thing, that kind of getting away was not possible in Europe. There was no place to get away to, right? This could really only happen in a place like America. Does this make sense?
Yeah, there is an informal, like you talk about that informal influence that drives them west. It's also true that before Utah could become a part of the United States, the Mormons had to officially, whether they did it unofficially or not, had to officially give up their belief completely.
But part of that was because America's government's influence actually now extended over the whole continent, whereas in the 1840s there was no sheriff in Utah. Right.
And they actually went to Spanish-held territory.
Yeah. By the time America, what's that?
Also wilderness over which Spain really had no control.
Right. It'd almost be like going to Mars. Like you could set up your own religion in Mars, right? If you could live there, right? So we haven't had Christendom in America formally since at the latest 1830s, right? We have had an informal Christendom for pretty much the whole history of the United States, which is leaking away, right? Which is dissipating. We're not likely to get a formal Christendom anytime soon. That seems highly, highly unlikely that America is going to embrace anything like a formal Christendom, right? So here's what does any of this have to do with us? These are kind of my last two application questions for the morning. What does it look like to have a genuine but real informal Christendom today in our communities? We'll talk right now about local communities. Maybe we'll expand that out to more of a national level. Thoughts? There's not necessarily a wrong answer. Just trying to help us think in these categories.
I think being Holy Spirit led and being willing to walk into those spaces and be identity within our community.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Holy Spirit naturally, when he's abiding, and when we're listening to him,
Mm-hmm.
will guide us into service.
Right. So living evangelistic lives where we're sharing the gospel with our neighbors. What about take it up one level, what about in terms of civil, public types of influence on local civil government or local institutions? We just had an election, right? There were some ballot initiatives. There's a ballot initiative on abortion, which clearly that was led by probably 98% Christian people, right? So that's an informal influence on actual law, civil law, that was led by Christian people, right? That's an informal Christendom that's real and important, and that we need to think strategically about how to exert as much influence on civil society as possible for the love of our neighbors, right?
And the protection.
Yeah, and for justice, right? For the justice for the unborn. Yeah, Amanda.
So maybe like an example could be my parents' church up in Wisconsin is opening a Christian daycare.
Mhm.
Would that be?
Sure.
It's based out of the church with the purpose of we want to provide daycare, but we want to also share the gospel with these kids.
Right.
So it's not just a civil, we're wanting to provide daycare for this community, but with wanting to also share Christ.
Yeah,
Would that be-
that's a good example. Yep.
At its core, we want citizens and government leadership that recognizes that they're accountable to God for the way they treat each other.
Yeah. We want our laws to reflect God's standards. We still want that, right? One thing that troubles us so deeply is when laws are written that are sort of opposite to what God's clearly designed order is, right? Yeah, Lynn.
I think one thing that helps is there's about 4 or 5 different organizations that are having an influence on our government. One is the Nebraska Family Alliance,
Mhm.
and I can't think of the names of the other ones, but they're a big influence.
Yeah, JJ used to work for one of those organizations. That was and you could talk more about it, but you're trying to exert good influence on godly principles, on public policy, actual public policy and law, right? You want to weigh in on what that was like?
Put me on the spot. It's all the stuff we're talking about here. It's like how do we speak truth into the culture, our case in the legislature, effectively,
Mhm.
that has a chance. So there's a strategic element to it. Where you ask yourself, does this have a chance to do good?
Does this move the ball down the field, or
Exactly.
yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, all those kinds of questions. Yeah, part of it was like writing legislation that would pass legal muster,
Mhm.
not just legislation that sounds good to us, but does this have a chance of passing and being effective and anticipating, like,
Yeah,
okay, what are some likely unintended consequences and
Right.
have legislation that anticipates that, all that?
these abortion referendums, the 434, somebody had to write that wording, right? And that was I don't even know who did that, but it was groups like what you're working for who would have said, here's a wording, can we legally get this to pass?
This was actually connected to the Attorney General.
Right.
Like it's from an outside, one of these groups are from outside the state who
Advise,
the lay of
yeah,
the land and
right.
say, what's the best shot that we have here?
right. Mark, what you're doing is an unofficial Christendom. Here's one you may not think of. We actually have, the pastors at our church have a good relationship with the sheriff's department and with the district attorney, who happens to be a conservative Roman Catholic. I think we can work together on common issues that are for the good of this community. It's not formal, right? But it's good to have good relations with people who are of similar have similar desires for God's standards to be flushed out in our society, right? Yeah.
You could think of like letters to the editor or Facebook posts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think of Lauren Lippincot's columns.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Letters that are actually convincing. So what a lot of people on the left and the right, a lot of what happens is people, what's called just virtue signaling, like where they just like put up their flag at which team I'm on so that my team members will think I'm cool. But like, how can we actually change hearts and minds? How can we put forward effective arguments that are really going to be, they're well-crafted arguments that could potentially convince people on the other side, right? We're not just trying to enjoy liberal tears, right? We're actually trying to change hearts and minds, right? Yeah. Okay.
And one of the things that I think prior to anyone being able to change anyone's hearts and minds, the logical, rhetorically forceful argument is that they have to be educated.
Mm-hmm.
They have to know how to read, how to write, and how to understand someone else's arguments.
Mm-hmm.
So education,
Yeah. Education is a huge institutional component to this, and I think homeschoolers who are often learning a whole bunch about this kind of stuff, and hopefully will become Supreme Court justices, and public school kids. We have believers in the public school who are trying to be leaven and salt and light, and you have Christian school who are trying to generate young people who are. So I think at all levels we need Christians trying to bring to bear the gospel and God's truth about reality at all levels of institutional, educational institutions, right? Harvard and Yale and Princeton were originally seminaries. These were institutions in New England. They were mostly Puritan seminaries, as Harvard was started as a Puritan. Obviously that all drained away, and now they're like as far as they could possibly. Part of that is because well, we're out of time. That's another story. But any final? Here's one. We don't have time to get into this, so I'll just leave you with this question. What does it look like? What does a genuinely biblical Christian view of religious tolerance look like? This is not an easy question either, so I'll just leave you with it. But any final thoughts?
I think we really have a unique system here in America that even in our states, I mean, our legislative districts are divided up geographically,
Mhm.
and run a bill on something that's
Mm.
important for the people.
Mhm.
I mean, we get asked all the time, what is it that I should be running a bill?
What are the people's priorities, right?
What are the people's priorities? And it really does start with someone just having an idea, talking to the legislator, and then crafting, and then there are people that will help craft a bill
Hmm.
that has the likelihood of making it through the different committees and
Mhm.
eventually make it through law. But I mean, it's a very standard process that is not overly complicated to actually get involved.
Right.
If there is something that you really do feel like you want to make a difference,
Mhm.
you know, from the side of the equation that would make a moral difference, or, and a lot of these things, I wouldn't call them amoral, but they are things that would make living together in a society
Mhm.
a better way to live.
Mhm. If you have kids or grandkids who are at all interested and are all bent this way, encourage them to consider a career in politics. We think that's dirty and nasty, and we should stay away from politics. That's part of the reason we're in this mess, right? Is because good people check out of these processes, right? All right, we're out of time. Mike, would you close us in prayer there?